Not with this question
Mhm.
because at
The
some point,
microservices, the Svitla.
every time we think about scaling up, one of the first options that off the top of our heads will be the holy grail microservices. Is it the only option? So let's talk about that. Let me introduce myself real quick. If you didn't know me, I'm Charlie. I'm a senior software engineer for Svitla and backend practice lead. I'm a computing science engineer and pretty focused on into Ruby, Elixir, Java, and architecture things. I'm a drummer and I'm so into calisthenics and mixology. And before starting, I really love always to give like a quote that I really like or somebody that I really admire. And this time, and I'm gonna break the ice with Marcus Aurelius' phrase: "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." So going forward, I'm going to show you what it's going to be the agenda. Essentially, we're going to go through what we have to think about when we have to scale that. So let's think about it. After that, we're going to talk about the monolith versus distributed monolith versus microservices. After that, we're going to try to talk about what is going to be the microservices, why are often the first option when scaling up. As well, we're going to talk about the microservices pillars. We're going to look at some definitions there. After that, the Jinyan, absolutely yes or no. When we have to think about scaling up, what things we have to think when we are scaling up and if it's going to be a yes or no. After that, we're going to talk about making a decision, strategies and tools, and final thoughts and next steps, and a little takeaway when we are wrapping up. Okay, so when we have to scale up, let's think about it. This is a term actually often utilized and not only in software development, because this change will impact the whole organization, it would think. So it is not only code. We think about the stakeholders involved, for instance. So the mindset will be throughout it. So landing the idea is crucial because it will create a strategy and there's no magic formula, or it will think about like the silver bullet. So we have to understand, build a plan, execute, and repeat iteratively. If we think about scalability, for instance, we can think about this. And actually, as a practical example that I really love to show up every single time when we're thinking about everything. Actually, that's a good example with agile methodologies. And right now, it is for scaling up. We think a little horse, and maybe all of a sudden we have to scale up and we think about this horse with a lot of paws and like muscles and power, and you can see it's like a god. So, and sometimes it's not. Maybe the way that I see when we're scaling up is not this way, it's more like this. Is the evolution of our product, our organization. Let's put here at the first step as any of these things that I mentioned before. So if we think about scalability, we may be talking about a software team, a company, even something that was intended to be scaled up, and it wasn't successful in a way that it was expected to be. Because if we think about, for instance, a distributed system, it's only microservices is not, as I mentioned before, because even there are monoliths that work as distributed systems. So let's think that we have the application into an on-prem server, and we have a database that is stored in RDS in AWS, and we're consuming some external third parties, such as Kafka, Datadog, that they are not living in the same server. So here you go. We have a distributed system, and we are not thinking about in terms of monolith. So which factors we have to think when we are thinking about scaling up? So users and requests, definitely before going all these factors are actually things that we have to think about. So the larger demand of users are, the higher the requests will be, thus increasing the amounts of operations. So even numbers lie, that definitely is something that I really believe. Metrics are important in order to track down, and the data given from will help us to determine which indicators to move forward and scale up. So here, for instance, the first one, user growth. So if your application is experiencing significant user growth and it might be time to scale up if your current infrastructure can no longer handle at some point the number of users. It can lead us to performance issues, definitely, and a slow load time, for instance, and even downtimes. Let's talk about data volumes. If your application builds, for instance, with large amounts of data, and you may need to scale it up and ensure that the data can be processed and analyzed in a timely manner. As the volume of data increases, you may need to upgrade your hardware, actually increase storage capacity, or use like more efficient algorithms to handle these loads. Sometimes we can think about the SQL or many ways that we have. For instance, in my case, I've seen it before, like a monster query that we have to split in many parts, and it's not possible. At some point, we have like a threshold that we reach, and it's not like more to move forward. So here's one of the factors definitely I will point out for sure. As well, we have the peak loads in your application experiences, spikes, for instance, in traffic, even if we have infrastructure in Docker or Kubernetes. So we can have like these kind of things that will affect our systems, or even if we have an outage. So peak loads often are related to this. Definitely performance issues. If our application is experiencing slow load times, crashes, or any other kind of performance issues, it may be time to scale down, definitely. So this kind of both upgrading hardware, optimizing code, or using different techniques for caching to improve the performance. And definitely, and the last one, but not less important, is the business goals. Definitely, we have to scale that in terms of the organization. We have to split things. We have to think if our application is expanding into new markets or offering new services, or for instance, company merge. So it may be time to scale that in terms to meet the demands of the growing business. This can involve adding new features, expanding infrastructure, or even new technology that we have to adapt if we think, for instance, in cloud applications. So actually something important to note here is the term of microservices. So sometimes we can think about, okay, it's just microservice. It's just create new services, and what we need to implement little things that we have to move. And sometimes even the fact that we know how or what a microservices is really important to know what is the real meaning of that. And I would say microservices in synthesis is going to are independently deployable services modeled around a business domain. And this is really important because sometimes it's not to extract just part of the code, it's beyond that. And they communicate with each other via networks, as well as an architecture choice. Moving forward, we're going to talk about any other options, and I'm not like intended to demonize the fact of using microservices. It's more the fact if we know the good things, or I would say the trade-offs and the drawbacks, and we're clear about the idea if we're going to implement a microservices. So it's important to know the concept of this architecture, because and my intention, as I said, is not to demonize this, but when we have the awareness of the tools and the power that we have, I think, as one phrase that I really like is from Spider-Man, is that with great power comes great responsibility. And I think it is true, this is true. So after having that awareness, so we can say like, hey, bring it on. I'm going to talk about real quick about monolith versus distributed monolith and microservices. For instance, in this case, we can think about the differences about that. So if we define in single words what a monolith is, I would say is in a monolithic architecture, the entire application is designed as a single unit. So actually here, and I really love this image because at some point we can see that the dogs are the exact same, but with little differences and different nuances at the same time. So actually focusing on what the monolith is the entire application designed as a single unit, where all the modules or components are tightly coupled, and the code base is located in a single repo, actually the same code base. And it's really easy at some point to develop, because in many applications started out this way. And for instance, if we think about beyond the code, is the deployment, the task, and they can become like complex probably when we have a lot of people working on this and we have like more functionalities, and when we have to, for instance, and it's one of the concerns that every engineer will have, is the fact of creating a deployment, and it will take more than 10 or 20 minutes. Even if we have like a task suite, it's really going to be like becoming complex. So sometimes we can think all of a sudden that we have monolith and we're moving into microservices, but there are another concept that I would say is in the middle of it, and it's called distributed monolith. So if I have to define what a distributed monolith is, I would say it is similar. Why? Because essentially it's deployed across multiple servers. At some point it's a monolith, but with some nuances around the microservices. And each node of server, it's a copy of the same code base, and they communicate with each other through a shared database or message queue. So actually distributed monolith are designed to handle large traffic. I would say it is like an improvement, or I would say the second evolution, or what a monolith is, and loads of cache and can scale horizontally, which is one of the advantages that this has. But they still suffer one thing that is going to be the tight coupling, and I'm going to talk about later on, but that's two concepts is definitely we have to think every time that we think about the scaling up. And it's really important to mention this because sometimes we're in organizations that we have three options. They're thinking about to scale up, we're in the middle of scaling up, or they need to start out on a scaling up process. And we don't know when it's going to be our time to scale up. So definitely knowing these things will be crucial for us in the organization that we're working. Talking about microservices, in summary, I would say this what I mentioned before. We have different trade-offs. For instance, the deployability, the development. We can have different teams specifically focus on develop these kind of services that it's going to be in different domain services, depending on what we want to split when we are thinking about that. In summary, monolithic architectures are simple, and definitely I would like to highlight that because it's not always something that we don't have to think. And if we are thinking about an application from scratch, we have to go directly to microservices. It's really possible if we start out with a monolith, and after that thinking about and the different aspects that we think first, moving into or scaling up. So actually, I would love to focus on why a monolith is not, bad as sometimes it seems to be. And maybe the order here, I would say monolith is not a legacy. And definitely it's because every single time we hear like, hey, we have an application that is a monolith, and it's going to be, oh my gosh, probably comes up that it's in a spaghetti, or definitely it's like a feng shui. If we touch anything, it will break up, and it's not, because at some point we can think about that is just okay. It's not a problem. It's not legacy code. So if we think about the first as simple developer workflows, is the fact of we can trace down every single file that we have in our application. We can try to trace down, for instance, if we're in a Ruby on Rails application and we want to go through from the routes, and after that go into the controller, and after that go into the model and maybe a decorator, and go through from top bottom and understand the workflows without going into another service, for instance, or even mocking up what is the other part of the wall. So focusing here is the fact of monolith is not legacy. And actually, I've seen it in my experience, many monolith that were good in implementation. So it's definitely another kind of thing when we think that a code will be great. If it is not a microservice, it's going to be a monolith. And definitely the third, and why I'm mentioning this, is the fact that monitoring will be just one place. And actually, this is one of the problems that microservices will have, is the fact that if you don't have an orchestrator, for instance, as Camunda, in using what they call its correlation IDs, monitoring will be really complicated. As well, the troubleshooting, because even if you're using different third-party tools, the troubleshooting will be better in terms of we don't have to coordinate things that are going to be spread in different services. We have all the things in just one project that you can work standalone in your development environment. And definitely the end-to-end testing, because at some point we're handling the whole thing in just one place. If we move forward, it's real important before going into microservices, a couple of terms that I love always to explain this. And actually in my experience, and when I implemented the first migration or scale up from microservices to distributed monolith, and after that microservices, there are a couple of things that definitely we have to look at. First is cohesion and coupling. So as you can see here, cohesion speaks to how changing one thing requires a change in another, and coupling talks to how we group related code. So if we can think about that, or explaining a little bit more what is coupling, refers to the degree of dependency between two or more components of a system. In microservice architecture, loose coupling is desirable, and where services are designed to have minimal dependencies between them. This allows services to be developed, test, deployed, and scaled independently without affecting other services. Loose coupling also enables the system to be more resilient. And this is a word that definitely I would highlight here, because in order to have a resilient service, it's really important if we have a big downstream in many services. And definitely if we have something that is failing at a certain point, we can locate it, trace it down, and fix it, and not interrupt the rest of them. So when we talk about coupling, that it will be another thing. It's the fact of the degree of dependency between them. My apologies, it was actually coupling. So when we talk about cohesion, on the other hand, it refers to the degree to which elements within the single service are related to each other. So in summary, in microservice architecture, loose coupling and highly cohesion are two key principles that help to achieve a scalable, maintainable, and resilient system, as I mentioned before. So services should be designed to have minimal dependencies between them. Loose coupling and each service should have a clear and well-defined purpose. So with related functionality grouped together, high cohesion. So why microservices are often the first option, and what I mentioned before is the fact of it's often the first option when you're scaling up. It's because if we think about a software system, because it offers several benefits. And I would say the fact of why we're using microservices is because we know all the great things about it. And even that with certain things that we have to deal with, we can say, okay, this works for me, this works for the team, this works for the organization, and we have all the things to move forward into us. So actually, talking about, for instance, things like scalability, resiliency, agility, team autonomy. So there are aspects that definitely we can think about when talking about microservices that will bring us a lot of advantages over having a monolithic architecture or any other kind of it. But as I said before, we have more than that, that it's going to be options. And I have here 5 options instead of microservices in case that yourself, your organization, or even the fact that all the variables that we have won't be exactly suitable for implementing a microservices structure. So for instance, here we have the modular monolith. And for instance, here is a variation of a monolith architecture where we have the monolith is broken down into a smaller and modular components, as the meaning of itself says. Or for instance, we have the cloud native architecture, and this is an approach that leverages cloud computing services to build deployed applications that are designed to run in a cloud infrastructure. And this approach can provide, as well, as I mentioned in microservices, scalability, elasticity, resilience, as well as enable faster deployment and I'd say greater flexibility compared to traditional monolith architecture. Actually, I had this experience working with both at the same time because there were two different organizations, but working in the same goal. Oh, excuse me.
Oye, pues no sé cómo hacemos para poder salvar que fue importante.
Oh, just 1 minute, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Actually, getting back to, for instance, the last one that I would like to explain, for instance, and it's really famous, is the serverless architecture. So this is an approach where the application logic, it's breaking down into a small stateless functionalities. I would say it functions, as you ever probably heard, the Lambda functions, for instance, in AWS. So this approach can enable rapidly scaling high availability, as well as reduce cost. That essentially is one of the things that we try to find every single time when we're thinking about scaling up and the cost of it in comparison with a monolith. If we are reducing the cost, it will be better than in terms of, okay, let's go for this architecture and we don't even know what's going to be the price of it. And definitely resources are going to be only used when the functions are triggered. So we can have or create like a module that it will be on demand in this term, and even experiment, because it allowed us to mix and match different technologies or approaches. So let's talk about real quick about the microservices pillars, and synthesis is real important. And actually, I highlighted this text that I heard from a talk actually from one of the pioneers of microservices from the book Monolith to Microservices, Sam Newman. And this text will be this way. So isolating failure is the fact that, okay, it's okay, we handle it. I mean, it's the fact that we have different services and only one, or maybe if there's two, which is okay, are failing, but they are not strictly related. So the fact that we can isolate the failure and we can go and troubleshoot what is happening there is a great advantage of the microservices here. As well, decentralizing, and I said that 1-2 split is the fact of we have different functionalities that we can have in a specialized team working specifically on that. If we have a microservice or a domain that is going to be for users or for payouts or for authentication, we can say, okay, they are not living in the same place. So if we have to modify something, we don't have to touch two domains, because at the end they are going to be decentralized, independent. And the third, it's going to be deployed independently. And this is one of the things that I really love about microservices, is the fact that we can reduce what is going to be the time of deployment, which is something that definitely the organization, if we have multiple environments, which is a really health workflow, is the fact if we're going from development to testing, and from testing to release candidate, and after that to stage, and after that to production, or any other environment that we have to test out before going to production. So definitely we have that thing that we love is freedom. So high implementation details, and at this point, it's the fact, and is not a bad term, because at some point it's we expose everything through contracts, and definitely the other services will be benefit by that, is the fact of we know the contract. It's essentially, I have to provide this information. Whatever it happens behind the scenes is not my business at some point, but I'll say it in a good thing, is the fact of we're getting all the benefits, and after that, the outcome. So after that, the automation culture is the fact of definitely we don't want to make everything manual. So we can think about we are going to automate using a lot of tools that we currently have in the market, that some of them will be, or most of them will be paid, but definitely it's worth it for the organization. And definitely is the fact, if you're running task suites or security tasks, for instance, or creating the buildings. So DevOps will be so happy to having this kind of things. And the last one, I would say client first, is basically your wish is our command, is the fact of we're caring about what the next client or the consumer will be needing in order to complete and fulfill the process that is intended to. So here we can think that it's going to be the priority for the service that is implemented the logic. So the yin yang. So here I'm going to talk about real quick what it's going to be, what options or what things we have to think to say yes or no. And maybe it's just more clear the fact if we're going to microservices or not, or if we're taking up with another of the scaling app solutions that I mentioned before. Here, and they're at some point listed out as contradictory, but they're complementing at the same time. Is the fact of Yin will talk about the good things that we have to think about when we're scaling up, is having a clear domain. Actually, when we created a strategy, when we are scaling up, it's important to have clear the domains. And after this, I'm going to talk about some tools that I used in the past and that effectively worked out when we were creating the domains. And when I'm talking about domains, is the fact of separating the concerns and having clear, if we're extracting a service, it will work out as we expect when we create what is going to be the aggregates and things. So from zero to hero, I would say it is the fact of we don't have to go from 0 to 100 all of a sudden. Is more the fact that we can go progressively in scaling up, extracting after determining that we have the domains, which service we have to work on, and after that step by step scaling up. So it doesn't happen, from one day to other. It's more the fact that we're doing it great. So slowly and steady wins the race. Definitely is the fact, if we create a good strategy and we try to create a consistent and bold plan about this, we will succeed. So the mindset in the organization is really important, because is the fact of scaling up, it doesn't not only affect a development team or a certain part of the organization. I think it's going to be a completely mindset. And if we're thinking about incrementing or adding more people in our teams and creating a lot of squads in our organization, we can think about that everything will be changed in terms of, for instance, ceremonies, even teams. And for instance, I can bring out the concept of SAFe, that is using agile in a more scalable way. Is the fact, if we are having a release trains, for instance, in many projects or services or teams, even in parallel. And the last one in the end is going to be, we know how it works, the trade-offs and the drawbacks, is the fact of having expertise on what we are working, what we can do, what we cannot do. Talking about the yang, it's the contradiction of the previous, is don't having an unclear domain will affect making decisions upon what we have to implement, because if we mix up not in a clear way what are the domains that we have to work on, could be messy. So as well, we can think about if scaling up will be an overhead. Sometimes at some maturity in our applications, we can create or think and say, okay, I'm going to scale up, but at some point it's improving what we currently have, or is not the right time to scale up. So it could be an overhead for our project instead of just a benefit. So thinking about managed software is one of the things that I don't recommend when we think about scaling up, because sometimes we have a specific software that it's highly coupled. Sometimes we can think about more from scratch. And I think this is a really exception most of the times, but definitely there's something that we have to look if this is our case in terms of managed software. So as well, if the organization doesn't line up with the process, it's definitely something that we have to speak up, because as I said before, is a mindset for the whole thing. It's not only a little part of it, and I would say it is part of the digital transformation if we're scaling up. Definitely the testing is one of the things, and based on my experience too, it's pretty complicated if we don't have a plan for testing distributed systems, actually, because it's one of the, I would say, bad parts of, or I would say problem here, because we have to think about the contracts, and because we don't know what's happening in another service. So testing this out is pretty complicated. And sometimes, for instance, and what happened to me, it was having one service and mocking the old services or the external services. And when I was spinning up my environment, most of the times I had like my computer going down, which is pretty cumbersome when testing in my local environment. So sometimes be limited the fact of if I'm implementing something and I have to deploy every single time to create a test or to test my entire solution, sometimes takes more time than expected. Expertise is one of the things that I have to mention here, because all of a sudden you cannot become an expert on microservices or in distributed systems. So it's definitely something that we have to be careful, but definitely we can jump in or step in and understand how this works, but definitely it's an expertise that it takes time to have it. And the last one, it's pretty simple, is not having a good reason. I mean, just because it's trendy or mainstream, or the idea just brings up, but we don't have clear idea why we're scaling up. It's important at some point to justify before not having a good reason, and just we want to do it and that's it. I would recommend most of the times to have a POC or sessions that will tell us if we have to scale up or not. So making a decision, strategizing tool, it's really important, as I said before, because at some point, if we're not at the right time to scale up, it's important to determine, or if we at some point we're delayed in terms of this had to happen maybe 2 months ago or the last quarter. So it's really important to determine that. So which tools will be part of that? And I really recommend Miro. I don't know, guys, if you heard about that before. And here is what I really like the fact of when we're starting or thinking about, discussing in the table if we're scaling up or not, is the quadrant. So the quadrant will determine two axes here. So you can see is increasing the ease of decomposition and increasing the benefit of decomposition. So when we're creating or generating the domains, we have to place at some point one domain in, every domain will be in one quadrant. So after or behind all these domains, we are going to have different microservices that will be like specific services for the domain, for the main core. And these services here will meet the criteria and say, okay, they are good candidates for the composition. So after determining that, we're going to be able and try to set the priority and say, okay, we're going to work, for instance, here on loyalty and invoicing. And after that, stock management, order management, notification, and finally dispatch. So actually, four things that definitely behind making a decision here, I will try to mention four that they are part of the strategy and using the quadrant is creating the domains, definitely understanding the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. It's really important because at the end, it demonstrates that we really know how our system it's made of. And the fact if we're moving forward with scaling up, it could be in parts and definitely creating the domains, it's crucial when we're scaling up and making decisions. So using the right tool, definitely thinking about collaborative tool, it will be really important because at the end we can have multiple sessions that with multiple teams and we don't know how many people will be involved in this. And trust me on that, there's a lot of people that will be involved. Prioritization definitely is something that we have to think because at some point everything will be urgent. And when in an organization, everything is number one priority, there's something that we have to look at. So definitely if we have awareness of saying, okay, we're gonna highlight this as a first priority, we have to try to start out in little and after that increment that burden. And definitely the base of all the things and what I use as well for the scaling up and with Miro, which is event storming. It's a little strategy that essentially it's brings you the fact of identifying all these characteristics or features that I mentioned before is the prioritization, creating in the domains, and definitely have a clear panorama about what we have to scale up right now or right away or in a little time, what is like the mid priority of it, and finally, what could wait a little time, but eventually will be scaled up. So final thoughts, next steps, and a little takeaway. In summary, understanding the best of every world is really important and done, as we say in Spanish, don't be married with just one thing, is the fact of if we are not using another architecture, it's pretty good to do the research and definitely understand what's behind of every other architectural possibility that we have, thinking about organizational time and budget. Creating the strategy is really important once we pick, or if we are doing a benchmark between or among, let's suppose, at most 3 options in terms of scaling up, but definitely creating a strategy will be crucial. And I'm not saying that it's going to be like a waterfall models or something like that. It's more to determine the minimum, I would say the MVP to pick the right choice. Evolving definitely, and as I said, is part of the mindset that we have to think about, that it's going to be an evolution instead of just stepping in just a distributed system. We can think about evolving and step by step in phases, but definitely set the goal will be really important for this. And finally, the eat code, scale up, repeat mindset. And I think here it's really important because this is something that is not going to be everlasting, but time to time we have to think about when is the right time to scale up again. So we cannot think and saying, okay, we're going to start this and we're going to hold it up for the year. And after that, we're going to take it again. So sometimes it's not something that happens. And definitely when we leave this behind, is really complicated to get back and take it again. And as a takeaway, buckle up and enjoy the journey. At the end, everything will be okay. And trust me on that. Sometimes, and I would say 90% of the times that we think about, the problems or everything that we have, sometimes when we're stuck with something, I talk to myself many times and tell me, hey, Charlie, at the end, it will be okay. So you have a great team, you have great skills, and just to sometimes go for a walk, because at the end, everything will be okay. And that's the goal here. And that's it for today. So thank you very much. I hope you had a great time. me. I hope that you didn't get bored or something like that. And I'm open up the channel for questions or anything that you like to bring up. I will be more than happy to answer all of them.
Hey, Charlie, apart from the book you mentioned, do you have any references for getting more acquainted with scalable systems, distributed systems, and everything related to that?
Absolutely. Actually, I recommend a couple of books from this author. It's Sam Newman. Is this way the last name. So he has a couple of books that definitely they helped me out in many scenarios and last projects that I was involved in. That one that I had to implement this kind of a migration. So this guy has this books is Monolith to Microservices and how to build microservices. I highly recommend this couple of books for and yeah for skilling up and or did it answer your question, Josue?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
My pleasure. So, is there any other questions, guys? Or if anybody wants to share with us any experience that had in the past with scaling up, so it will be.
I got a question, but perhaps it's not something easy to answer. But how much would you say it may save money to a company going from monolithic to microservices? Like I understand it's scalable, and at certain point the savings come when you're growing the infrastructure, right? But how much would you say a company could save? Like 50%? I mean, in terms of money, and I'm talking about sales, right? So, which is part of my role.
Absolutely. And actually, it's a good question because every approach will have its own pros and cons. And for instance, and using that as an example, it depends on how impacted the organization is by the right choice of their architecture. Because for instance, I worked for a company, they were a fundraising company. So essentially the main profit source were the funds that they were coming from the outside. And for instance, one of the decisions or one of the things that why we migrated from Monolith to Microservices was the fact to extract the payout system, because they had this vendor that had many outages in the month. So in average, they were losing like 10 or 15% of the funds because they were perceiving that in peak loads during the morning that actually were the most intensive time for receiving funds. So at some point, extracting them into a microservice or scaling out the payout system. And we had many options. For instance, if they wanted to use this vendor, but at some point they had an outage or, they were down. So we had the workaround of using Stripe, for instance, or another vendor. So I wouldn't say exactly how much, but definitely if one area is directly impacted by that, it will avoid and definitely save a lot of money. For instance, if it is the source, of the money or the incoming money. So I wouldn't say a number in average, but I would say it's close to 25% sometimes, or even more, if it is impacted by that. Because if we even have the vendor, for instance, up for receiving money, so how do you receive money? And even if they are troubleshooting, sometimes the ETA will be 1 or 2 hours. So it's one of the examples that definitely I'll give you, in terms of how an organization could be impacted by that if the main source of money would be, a vendor that it's down sometimes. That's a
Great.
more.
Yeah, it's a great example. Let's just talk a little bit more about that, because I think there may be some sort of success story or something we may draft, on a commercial side to try to talk about, when we talk to our clients about modernization of their systems. This is pretty much this kind of stories and example. That's exactly what they want to hear. So thank you, Charlie.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I know how I answer your question. So anybody else or anybody, voluntarily who wants to, share any experience with microservices. So, okay, we have one comment here from Juan Carlos. I recommend you all to listen to this podcast episode, explain how to Stack Overflow it's built and why is a monolith. Great. Thank you very much. Actually, that is a great thing because as I mentioned before, the fact of monolith, it doesn't mean that it's legacy or evil at some point. So it's pretty good to know, that many are, and probably most of the famous application that were started out as a monolith, or there's still, monolith, which is not bad at all. So thank you, Juan Carlos.
Actually, sorry guys. Recently, GitHub released like a blog entry where they are explaining why they are a Ruby on Rails monolith yet, and it is pretty interesting. I'll try to find it, and if I find it, I'll share it. But yeah, always in the same line, right?
Awesome. That sounds great, Jose. Thank you very much, actually, for sharing that. It will be awesome to have that. My pleasure, Olga. So yeah, if there's no more questions or things that you like to bring up, so it's been my pleasure to be here and having this opportunity. Definitely, if you have like more questions or anything that you'd like to share with the rest, so more than welcome. If you want to hit me directly, so I'm gonna be there. And oh, we have a question from Ulrich and
Hey, Charlie, how are you?
hey.
I your talks. Thank you very much for everything. Now, my question is more related to the documentation, because in my experience, right, for example, I work for an airline company. I will not say the name, of course, and there was a lot of endpoints, a lot of things, a lot of resources, and it was a kind of mess. In some moment, we had many endpoints, many places for getting information. And in your experience, which is the best way to have everything in order, everything properly documented? Well, whatever, the best way to have everything and be able to use it.
Absolutely. And definitely, thank you very much actually for bringing that up, because at some point when we are, getting into organization, most of the times, and definitely is like the everlasting story, is the documentation thing. And we all know that it's something overwhelming actually start out, but definitely having things, for instance, like exposing, for instance, REST APIs, or if you have a microservices with all the contracts. I don't remember exactly the name of the tool, but I'll share it later on. And it's an incredible tool that you can publish, for instance, your endpoints, and at the same time creating documentation about the contracts. So if you have cleared the contracts in your domain, it will be something that at some point you don't need specifically the documentation, because itself is, explanatory. But at the same time, I'd say tools like Swagger, for instance, they are pretty good for documentation, because at the end you can go through the code and it could be like fully loaded of comments. But the fact if the code is well organized and definitely you have cleared the contracts, at least you will understand, for instance, how they are being used, and how they are implemented at some point, because the fact that we have different domains and they hide the details, at least if you have clear what the contract is, it doesn't matter, what's happening behind the scenes. It could be obviously a matter of, or a problem, or it will rely on the team that is working on this domain. But essentially, if you're hiding the details, it's so binary in terms of saying like how this is working, what I'm providing as an input, and what is, the outcome of that. But if I have to think about tools for documentation, I think Swagger and what is the name of the tool? Oh my gosh, it's ringing the bell, but I don't remember right now, but it's just exposing the endpoints actually, and you can test actually out with little inputs if you want to know how the contract is working, and have like a little way that you can test the contract directly on the URL that they are providing to you. So it's pretty simple, I think. And actually, for one of our organizations that I work, it was satellite imagery industry. They had this, and it was a huge downstream that they had, and it was pretty useful, talking about that this company had more than 9,000 employees, I think, and an engineer, and I don't even remember how many of them we were, but it was definitely a thing that worked with a lot of people in different services and different domains in a big system, to be honest.
Awesome, excellent. And if you don't mind, I will ask you something else. What do you think which is the best way, talking about security, right? Because, all right, we have several tools to make it more secure. I don't know, just using the Kubernetes gateway, or just a token and OAuth. What do you think is the best way to add some security, right, in our system, distributed systems?
I think from my point of view and based on my experience is having a good support and actually a good team specialized in having different layers and the right tools in the market for authenticating, because at the end we can have leaked off, information, and definitely hiding the details. Even, if you have different microservices in the cloud, will be really important and crucial, because some of the services will be exposed as public APIs, for instances. But if you have internal services, definitely having things like Okta, for instance, or different levels, even at the service level. For instance, you can have Okta for authentication in the service, but if you have, for instance, policies talking about, internally for the service, that you need like more tokens, and definitely is not creating over engineering or extra layers for the service per se, but it's definitely, or what I would recommend is defining the access levels that you will have per every service and domain at the same time that you will have in your entire system. So beyond that, if you're using cloud solutions, for instance, Azure or AWS, try to know every edge or maybe every tool in detail in terms of how will you implement the security, in terms of the network. For instance, if you have internal networks or VPCs in terms of, accessing certain levels of the application, as well, I would say this certificates, or for instance, certain rules, or I would say standards in terms of accessing every server. And for instance, not use something like something that it will be in the local storage in your browser, and just not renewing the keys or all that kind of things, that it will be by levels. But definitely having standards and knowing pretty well what you have in your tools, if you're using a cloud solution, for me will be crucial in terms of security when you have microservices, or talking about more like a distributed system.
Excellent answers. Thank you very, very much.
Absolutely. Oh, by the way, I already recall the name. It's apiary. It's this.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, apiary was the name of the tool that I used for exposing documentation about the
Awesome. Awesome.
Sorry.
I knew Swagger, but not this one. I will take a look at it. Thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Okay, there you go. I don't know if there's more questions. If not, thank you very much, Thurs, and I hope that you have an awesome rest of the Thursday, and I hope to see you soon. So definitely, this is part, I'd say, of serious, and I'm aiming to have a next one. And if you're interested, it will be around event sourcing and CQRS. It's really trendy nowadays. So feel free to, ask me any questions. Don't hesitate if you want to hit me up directly on Slack, and I'll be more than glad to have a coffee and talk about all the things or any other things. So thank you very much and have an awesome morning.